Hello again, Ancestry Cousins and Inquiring Minds. The last video I made, I left off reading a long article called The Bleak House, Once Country Residence of Alexander R. Shepard Among Early Estates on Georgia Avenue by John Claggett Proctor. So I went back and finished reading or reread that article, and I want to say, please read the article if you have relatives or you're interested in doing any type of studying about the changes that they made in that area in Brightwood, which was part of an area that colored people lived called Vinegar Hill. So in that article, it also has a lot of other people, not just black people. It's a genealogical article, really, because it just talked about other people that lived in that area at that time. And the changes that were made to the road names. And so we're going to go back to that article for just a minute, because there was something in this article that Aunt Betty, Elizabeth Thomas, allegedly said that caught my interest, and it made me do some more research on it. Like, how authentic is that? Did they put that in the newspaper? Sometimes it just be like, oh, that just sounds like something they threw in the newspaper. Okay. So we're going to start right here in this article. This esteemed relic of Early's raid on Washington, who continued to reside in the facility of the fort until her death at an advanced age, was always glad to recount this sad episode on her early life when General McCook appeared among the cabins and said, "I want you women and children to get out of here. These cabins will be burned." "What for?" asked Aunt Betty. "I'm going to form a line of battle," answered McCook. "Huh," said Aunt Betty, looking at the crippled men of the garrison. "You can't form much of a line of battle with that force when there ain't none of them to fire a gun. You will have to move out. The rebels are coming." Again, he ordered the general. "That ain't nothing," cried Aunt Betty. "The rebels always been here." However, in spite of Aunt Betty's protests, the cabins were destroyed and as other property in the vicinity as a military measure, but not in after years. The Grand Army held exercises at Fort Stevens. This old colored woman was always present as the guest of honor. Okay, now that's what she said, and it was recorded. Every time I go to make a video, my throat gets dry and I start coughing. Okay, so let's go to the NPS article on Early's raid. It says, Early's raid, Rock Creek Park. The defenses of Washington had been built during the early part of the war, when the Union defeat seemed a real possibility, but they saw no fighting until July 1864. Now I'm going to read some articles from the Washington newspapers through July 11th through the 14th or 13th later on, because I'm going to get to the whole gist of it. When victory seemed close at hand, Grant's army had bogged down in front of Petersburg, and Lee sought to take advantage of the situation by launching a bold raid on the north. Confederate Lieutenant General Jubal Early, in command of 14,000 soldiers, marched down the Shenandoah Valley and forded the Potomac at Shepherdstown on July 5th, 1864. On July 9th, the Confederates defeated a small Union force along the Monocacy River in Frederick, and they advanced toward Washington. At that time, few soldiers manned the defenses of Washington because Grant had stripped the garrison to reinforce the army in Virginia. So they really ain't have that many soldiers at the defenses because they had been sent out to Virginia. Washington seemed to be at Early's mercy, but the city had been at war for 3 years, and the Union veterans coolly set about organizing a defense. Among the wounded soldiers recuperating in the city was a cavalryman named Major William Fry. Fry made the rounds of the city's military hospitals and assembled nearly 500 troopers by commanding every man well enough to ride. They requisitioned horses and set out on the road to Rockville, Maryland, where they met the Confederates' own horsemen and skirmished all day on the 10th. These cavalrymen kept commanders in Washington well informed about Early's movements, allowing reinforcements to be sent to threatened areas around the city. Meanwhile, the Veteran Reserve Corps was called to arms, a force of older men, semi-invalids, and clerks from the War Department, most of whom had not been in combat since the Mexican War. After a great deal of command confusion, reading accounts in these days, it sometimes seems that there were more generals in Washington than soldiers. Major General Alexander McCook was put in command of the defense. Grant had sent 2 divisions of veterans northward by ship, so McCook's tactic was to delay Early's Confederates until the reinforcements arrived. The newspapers revealed in the city's calm response, one editor remarking the annual invasion of Maryland, which next to the weather supplies the sensation of this week, does not excite very disturbing apprehension of the safety of Baltimore and Washington. So right there, I'm not going to read. I'm going to stop reading that right there. Hold on. No. Determined to press his advantage, Early pushed on, arriving at Fort Stevens at noon on July 11th. He noted that the fort seemed undermanned, but impressed by the very formidable character of the works. He did not order an immediate assault. Some of his men thought he made the mistake. One wrote later, a volleyball, a rebel yell, a vigorous charge would have given us Washington. But Early suspected that Union reinforcements were on the way, and he knew that his own men were tired from a long march on a hot, dry day. He wanted to make a careful reconnaissance, give his men time to rest, and form up a strung-out units properly for the attack. So he wanted to line them up, make sure they rested. As it turned out, he was probably wise to hesitate. At the very moment he reached Fort Stevens, steamships carrying thousands of Grant's veterans were docking downtown, and to the cheers of residents. Had Early attacked at noon, he might have found getting out of the city much harder than getting in. Okay, so what did Aunt Betty say? She said she was talking to McCook. She said, who you gonna put? You talking about them old men? This article just said they went and got the invalids, the old people. They got who they could. And so we're going to read this right here, because they said they looked at the works and said, nah, we ain't going to try to mess with this till we get some more. They was waiting for enforcement. So this article comes from the Army Corps of Engineers. Like, what? Women and this kind of stuff. I just keep clicking and clicking and clicking. So it was actually defenses that they built to protect the city that actually held Early back. Because Early, and the men were tired. They had marched like 40 miles. I didn't get to that part, but I already know because I read it. The United States Army engineers devoted more time, resources, and effort to defend Washington, D.C. from any attack than any other single enterprise during the Civil War. I never heard of that before. Over the course of the rebellion, they continually expanded and improved the defenses to meet new demands and achieve greater levels of security in the face of a determined and aggressive foe, primarily Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia. Initially, the city's defenders were only effective when garrisoned by a large force and really served as a line of last resort and in case defeat in the field. Eventually, the growing strength of Washington defenses allowed Union Commander Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant to operate completely on the offensive without having to employ his field troops to guard him on attack of the capital. Therefore, the defenses on Washington not only served to protect the nation's capital, but ultimately allowed federal forces to go on relentless offenses that eventually brought an end to the war. So I'm going to go down a part in here. He said, before the Civil War, the U.S. could only count 120 Army engineers, a small cadre of the Army's top West Point graduates, whose roles were as diverse as their duty stations. I got a bad glare from the window, sorry. And the rapidly expanding nation. They were highly respected seacoast defenders, surveyors, explorers, naturalists, hydrologists, builders, and military strategists. In times of war, however, the country still depended on temporary volunteer forces, raised locally, so they know the area, to serve their state's defense. Known as regulars, the permanent members of the U.S. military, including the engineers, did not lead the volunteer state forces unless they left the regular army. Whether seeking opportunities for promotion or battlefield experience, when the Civil War broke out, many engineers took leave of their regular ranks to lead volunteer units in battle. Others resigned their commissions to take up arms for the rebellion Confederacy, leaving only 30 engineer officers on duty by the time of the first Battle of Manassas in July 1861. For those who remained, roughly half were assigned to protect the Union capital from enemy attack. Only a few hundred yards separating essential U.S. government buildings, including the White House, from Arlington Heights in enemy territory in Virginia. If the United States was going to keep its capital in D.C., then it will require the greatest engineers to defend it. I didn't got into a story here. Now I didn't got interested. See, that's what I like to do. I would create my own story. All right. So this one right here, I'm not going to read this, but it brings up General McCook. I'm going to put the book in there. This is, what is the book? Because I don't want to read too much of the military stuff. If people are interested in it, they can read the military stuff themselves. But I just wanted to point out the fact of what Aunt Betty said, how she said it, and who she was talking to. And then you read this, and that is documented in other places too. Of that they said that they had to call in like older people that had been, retired. And had been in the hospital, so they weren't in the greatest of shape. But they came when they called. They came to the defense of the city, and I thank them for that. And the people that lived in the city thanked them for that. Okay, so we're going to move on. So when she was, the area that she was living in, Phyllis Proctor Thomas, with Brightwood, but that's area where they was talking about was called Vinegar Hill. And so I went back and looked after she allegedly, passed in 1917. I went back to see what happened with the community where we don't hear anything about Vinegar Hill anymore. So I went back to the newspaper. So I'm going to read some articles. So Negro housing plight here to grow worse. A women shoppers told. This article is from the Evening Star, January 5th, 1944. Watching the time, 14 minutes. Okay. Fear that the Negroes in the district, see, they changed the language. Before I was reading those articles before they were colored. Now they're saying Negroes, but okay. Already living under overcrowded and sometimes insanitary conditions because of the critical shortages of Negro housing here may force even greater housing problems with the future, when expressed yesterday by Ms. Pauline Reed Coggs, Executive Secretary of the Washington Urban League. Speaking at a luncheon today of the Washington League of Women Shoppers held by the YWCA, Mrs. Coggs emphasized that there was a scarcity of vacant land here available for Negro housing, and that many areas once established as Negro neighborhoods were being transformed by white occupancy. Okay, speaking at a luncheon meeting of the Washington League of Women Shoppers held by the YWCA, Mrs. Coggs emphasized that there was a scarcity of vacant land here available for Negro housing, and that many areas once established as Negro neighborhoods are being transformed to white occupancy. As examples of vanishing Negro neighborhoods, she cited Fort Reno and Vinegar Hill, where only a few colored families remain. Georgetown, where white families live in many houses once occupied by Negroes, and Garfield's section of Southeast Washington, which is in the process of transformation. Critical problem. Come on, thing, slide down. This trend represents a critical problem of the Negro, Ms. Coggs said. Let me make this smaller. Okay. Because when a house in which is lived is remodeled for rental to whites or condemned for construction to public building, there are few, if many, places in the district in which he can move. There are no vacancies in existing Negro housing, and the policy of builders is to erect housing for Negroes only and establishing Negro neighborhoods, she pointed out. Mrs. Coggs expressed fear that plans for the post-war redevelopment of Washington will call for the condemnation of much housing now occupied by Negroes to make way for new public buildings without adequate provision being made for the resettlement of the displaced families. The result, she said, may be the establishment of racial minority ghettos in overlying areas. No legislative safeguards against such a possibility are contained in any of the urban redevelopment plans now. So I'm not going to read that whole article. So we're going to go to the next article, which is January 21st, 1944. Mrs. F.D. sticks to guns and rolls over housing here. From Vinegar Hill, an exclusive Old Georgetown, to Bradbury and Congress Heights, Mrs. Roosevelt yesterday toured to learn how acreage of Negro homes has shrunk through encroachment by white dwellings. And as a result, today, she stuck to her guns on the issue of rezoning Bradbury and Congress Heights. Congress Heights property owners blame Mrs. R because the zoning commission turned down their position to rezone their section from A to A restricted, which would have excluded group housing and virtually closed the door to Negro homes. The First Lady was against it and also is against the same proposition for Bradbury Heights, still under consideration for the zoning commission. But Mrs. R denied changes by angry Congress Heights homeowners made at the meeting Tuesday night, as she exerted any influence in the zoning commission. All I did is what I have written and said publicly, she declared. I did this to call the matter to public attention. If a problem exists, I see no other way to work towards solution except to make people think about it. The tour, of which Mrs. R was occupied by members of the Emergency Committee of the Housing of the Metropolitan Washington, Mrs. Coggs and Frederick Thorne. Vinegar Hill is a small and isolated group of 14 Negro homes just off 16th Street Northwest at Fort Stevens Drive near Fort Stevens. This was at one time a 40 or 50 acre section of sparsely located homes dating back to the Civil War, when Negroes came to Washington and cluttered around forts for protection. Surviving Negro homes there are entirely surrounded by large apartments and nice homes occupied by white citizens. I'm not going to read all that because I told you something right there. So, what happened to Vinegar Hill? I'm going to the next article. Mrs. Roosevelt toured, so this is the same day, but a different newspaper. Mrs. Roosevelt tours areas once available to color, calls Burberry Heights normal place that expands multiple family housing units. Mrs. Roosevelt toured Northwest and Southeast Washington, Georgetown, and Arlington, Virginia yesterday to study constant restriction of space for colored housing by expansion of white housing in areas once available to coloreds. So I'm not going to read that anymore either. We're going to go to the next article. So this is the last one. Vinegar Hill colored settlement may soon be gone from our memory, but a memory. The colored settlement on Peabody Street Northwest on 14th and 16th Streets may be only a memory soon to Washington residents. The zoning board yesterday held a hearing to it and adjacent property zoned to permit the building of apartment houses. Most of the residents of the Hill own their property, while the settlement consists of only 12 houses, a church, and a riding academy. It was in existence long before 16th Street was built beyond Florida Avenue. Long before 16th Street was built beyond Florida Avenue, because Florida Avenue was Boundary Street. After that, it was country. There are no water or sewer facilities on the property as the residents get their water from an old-fashioned hydrant on 16th Street. While the residents are poor, police of 6th Precinct say it is one of the most orderly sections. Several months ago, John Poland, a builder, requested that an acre of ground west of 14th Street be zoned so he could enlarge the building operation he was contemplating on 14th Street Northwest of Missouri Avenue and Peabody Street. He planned 130 unit apartment building. So I'm not going to read any more past that. So what happened to Vinegar Hill? It got developed. We can't say it got gentrified because it was country. So it didn't get gentrified. It got developed. So when you think about all of that stuff up there and you read through those articles and you read those street names and how they got changed over, and you ride through there and just look at that and think about that, that was country right there. It's not too long ago. But what happened to the people that were living there? What happened to this lady's family? Well, because of the information that I found, I was able to, well, in one of the articles it said Billy Grant, which he was William Grant, which I did remember that. So I was able to, with all of the information that I was able to find, I did do a tree, a quick tree, just a little, just a little quick tree, and I added what I could find, and I did go that I know that her family, even up to him, they lived on that land for 100 years. So if Lincoln told her in 1861 that she had been living there before that, so at least 100 years of 3 or 4 generations at the minimum lived on that land around Fort Stevens. And at that point, when I traced to the grandson William Billy Grant and down to his granddaughter, his daughter, that was, I left it alone because I'm not trying to, but I do have it public, and I did find that there are people that have from his lineage or from her lineage that don't have any of that information on their tree. They don't even have like who the people were before the people. And I'm like, I just came in and I don't know them at all, and just came in and did all of that stuff just because I was reading the newspapers. Oh, and I got this book too. the Lost Farms and Estates, which I didn't even read from, but Aunt Betty is listed in this book. And I wanted to say too, is that I like comparing the information and the sources of the stuff that I read, because different sources, you know, let's say we put our little in something. Even as I read this stuff, and I like when I was telling you, when I was reading this stuff about the plagiarism, and I was like, okay, well, he said he just found his way into his book. You know, everybody put their little comments and stuff in it. So when I read newspaper articles, remember that there are people writing these newspaper articles, and they're writing it with their perception and their thoughts of, you know, on how the situation is. So thank you for watching. See you next time. Hope you enjoyed the video.